Hello and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, a podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host, Andy Smith. Throughout the series, I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys and to hear some incredible stories along the way. The Overlanding podcast is now available on iTunes, where you can subscribe to get the latest episode direct to your device. If you're not an iTunes user, you can also hear the show on Stitcher. You can download the free app today from your app store. Whichever platform you use, please do rate and review our show. If none of those options float your boat, you can also listen directly on our website at theoverlandingpodcast.com. In this episode, I finally got to meet a fellow overlander who has been following and supporting our Around the World in 800 Days adventure since day one. Paul Crittenden is a motivational man whose outstanding overlanding achievements are nothing short of inspirational. This episode was recorded live at the Adventure Overland show in Stratford-upon-Avon, so the church-like audio and background noise is apparent throughout the recording, unfortunately. Hopefully it doesn't detract from your listening pleasure. Okay, let's begin. Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Hi, nice to finally meet you.
Indeed.
First things first, before we get you to introduce yourself, if you could just answer this question for me, that would be delightful. Out of these 5 locations, where would you prefer this interview to take place? A, near a babbling brook in a lush green valley. B, in a little tent on a windy mountaintop. C, on a warm beach with the sea lapping at your feet. D, around a nighttime campfire in a forest. Or E, deep in a tropical jungle.
Oh, I think it has to be the campfire.
The campfire.
Yeah,
Perfect.
that's the best place for conversation, really, isn't it?
It's the best place for conversation. It's generally where you meet other overlanders.
It is indeed.
It is
in
indeed.
fact, I was doing that just last night.
Yeah, which is hence the reason why I've got quite a husky voice this morning.
Yes, a good night.
Okay, we've now magically been transported around a campfire.
Sounds fantastic.
Okay, if you could just introduce yourself, please.
Sure, I'm Paul Crittenden, an overlander, amongst other things, and been overlanding for about 11 years, and 2 significant trips that I've undertaken. One is from the UK out to Mongolia through the stands, and more recently a true circumnavigation of the world. It took 4.5 years. It was supposed to take 18.5 months, but it took 4.5 years in the end.
Good. I like it when trips...
Oh yeah, when they go wrong in the right way.
Yeah, they go wrong in the right way. That's definitely a good way to put it. And both of those trips, did you undertake them in the same vehicle?
No, the first one was a crazy lunatic thing. It was we went in a Suzuki 413, which is a tiny little 4-wheel drive.
Yeah.
It was a very old thing, and we actually left it in Mongolia. It was part of a charity rally.
Okay, would that be the Mongol rally?
The Mongol rally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I responded to a text from my elder brother. He texted me a URL on my phone and said, "What do you think of this?" And it all started there, really. So he's to blame.
Okay, and so that was actually going to be my next question, was how did you actually kind of come up with the idea of actually getting in? Did you know overlanding existed before the Mongol rally?
Not in the phrase overlanding. I knew that people travelled in vehicles and went to crazy places and went on long trips, but I wasn't aware of an overlanding community, and I wasn't aware of the activity of overlanding. No. So I wasn't even aware of the Mongol rally. So when I got this URL on my phone, it was just like, what the hell's that?
Yeah.
But it seemed like a crazy enough idea.
Yeah. And what year was that?
That was 2005.
2005. Oh, that's a while ago then.
Yeah.
That must have been. Was that the first?
No, it's about the third, I think.
Third. Okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And at that time, how many cars were taking part?
I think there was about 100 cars.
Yeah.
In that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was insane. Absolutely insane.
You'll have to excuse the background noise in the recording. Paul and I are actually at the Adventure Overland show in Stratford-upon-Avon in Shakespeare country, and for me it's been really quite incredible being here because we've managed to meet a lot of people who've been following our trip.
which is the first time we've ever had that. We've come back to the UK and we've had loads of people come up to us and just saying, "Oh, you guys are the 800 Days guys. We've been following your trip."
And for the last 2 years, I've been insanely jealous of you still being on the road.
And Paul is one of those people. We had a lot of contact with Paul, and he helped us out and sent us some amazing messages. And I think you donated also, which certainly, quite a few times.
Things went awry.
Yeah, and that certainly helped us out no end. So it's really nice to finally meet you in the flesh. Yeah. And then that's also the reason why I've got a bit of a husky voice this morning as well. There's been lots of tales from around the campfire. Okay, so your second trip then.
Yep.
Once you'd got the kind of taste for the travelling by car for the Mongol Rally. Yeah. What was the gap in time between leaving?
We left the UK in June 2010. So I guess you could say it was sort of 4 or 5 years. But in reality, the two of those years were building the vehicle before we left. So really, it was a case of just really allowing that idea to germinate. Yeah. And then really finding the courage to make the decision, because that for most people is the biggie. Do I give up what I've got in order to go and do what I want to do? Yeah. And, that was I won't deny that was quite a challenge for us.
Yeah. And so I presume at that point you sold up? You sold everything?
No, we sold everything bar the house.
Yeah.
Helen was very, very keen on keeping the house. And having something to come back to. So, and it also meant that we could rent it out, which meant that there was
some
after
income.
we paid the mortgage, there was a tiny amount coming in every month, about £100, I think. That helped towards costs. It all adds up.
Yeah. And that second trip, you took a Land Rover, right?
Yeah, Land Rover Defender, 110 station wagon.
Okay. And your particular reasons for choosing that?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I think they weren't technical reasons. They were purely aesthetic reasons. I love the look of the Defender. I'd never driven one before. Yeah. So it was I had no idea. But once I'd had a go, drove one around, I thought, that feels like it's the kind of car that would make it around the world. Yeah. And it's very capable, of course. Yeah. And one of my ambitions was to not just drive around the world. Lots of people do that, but to do a true circumnavigation of the world, which means going through 2 antipodal points opposite each other on the planet, and also to explore the remotest places as we travel. So I wanted something that was capable enough to take on that challenge. Yeah.
One thing that a lot of people find quite daunting and is often restrictive when you're overlanding. A lot of people undertake long trips by themselves, so you'd be travelling in just your vehicle, and certainly when you're heading out into the desert and things like that, it can be quite daunting and sometimes not the most sensible thing to do. Certainly we've driven through quite a few deserts on our own, and that can be quite daunting, and I think sometimes that can be restrictive, because I think people feel they need that safety net of another vehicle with them before they can start getting off into the wilds. And certainly people underestimate how capable their vehicles are, which, I don't know, to some degree is restrictive. Where's the kind of most remote places you've been?
I think the most remote places we've been were deserts, and perhaps the most remote was the deserts in northwestern Argentina, the high altitude deserts there, in Punta de Atacama. Yeah. And we spent a week driving there, didn't see a soul, and it was on terrain that we believe had only seen the passage of maybe a dozen cars in a year. So it was a very remote place. Yeah. And I was picking up on your point about people feeling that it's safer to go in pairs. I think that's true. I think if you've got two vehicles travelling together, it optimises your chances in recovery situations. It means that if something goes wrong, there's always a vehicle to get you out of there. And I think it's fair for people to take that on board and to go as far as they feel comfortable to go in terms of the risk taking. But risk is also mitigated by other things. So by experience, by pre-planning, by good preparation, by good skills. So I think that the danger comes not from the actual environment, but it comes from underestimating the environment and not preparing yourself appropriately for it. So I think that's a really important point. So I would never have driven into those remote regions
if you weren't
in the
unprepared.
first 3 months of my trip.
Yeah.
I learned an awful lot about myself and about the trip, about the vehicle, about how to overland safely, and as we went along, and the more remote it got, the more we tested ourselves against those environments, and so became more confident. And I think that's just the way that it works.
Yeah, you recognise the level where you're comfortable, and you kind of act within those parameters.
And also, I think that I have quite an adventurous past, so mountaineering, rock climbing.
Yeah.
So I knew in myself how confident I was about assessing risk and taking risk, and so I knew when it was dangerous, but I also knew what to do to mitigate that risk.
Yeah.
That danger.
And those high altitude deserts, what kind of altitude are they at?
I believe they're about 4,000 metres.
Okay, so did
about
you?
12,000 feet.
Yeah. Did you have any problems with the car at that altitude?
Not at that altitude.
Yeah.
Later on in the trip we did, when we
got a bit higher.
down in Peru, when we got a bit higher, it became, it struggled a bit. But not as much, I have to say, as the Toyota in front of us.
Well, that's interesting because certainly you mentioned you came up through Central Asia. Did you drive the Pamir Highway?
No, we didn't.
Did you go that way? Yeah. We drove the Pamir Highway, and I think the highest pass is about 4,600 metres, and our vehicle just lost so much power at that altitude, and it would smoke like crazy. At that particular time, we were travelling with a German couple in a G-Wagon, and they were kind of testing their vehicle because they were, after they'd driven the Pamir, they were going to drive onto the Karakoram, which I think is maybe another couple of 100 metres higher yet. And they had a brand spanking new G-Wagon, and they were really concerned about all the sensors, all the air sensors playing havoc, basically, with the ECU. But their vehicle operated fine as well.
Yeah.
But it did get to the point where we had to park facing downhill, so that when we started the cars in the morning, it would have a bit of momentum before it would get going.
I mean, my Defender is a 300 TDI, so it doesn't have the complications of the sensors, but being a very basic engine, it also doesn't self-adjust.
Yeah.
So you just have to be cautious of that stuff.
Yeah. And any other problems with the?
Well, it's interesting because we had a lot of vehicle-related incidents, and it got to the point where when we were posting those on social media, people would be saying, "Oh, well, that's because you got a Land Rover." But the reality is, the majority of the things that broke or wear out would have broken or worn out through normal use because we did a lot of miles. We had a couple of accidents. We had some, unexpected breakages. So, for example, we snapped the rear axle casing in the Torres del Paine National Park.
Okay.
Well, that doesn't happen every day. That's
No.
not. That's obviously an issue around, carrying too much weight, maybe, but also fatigue. The vehicle's, very old. So, so we had some incidents, but I always say to people that's part of the adventure.
Yeah, definitely. It's and it's generally in those situations, although at the time they can be incredibly stressful, but when you look back at your trip, generally good things come out of bad situations, whether it be meeting people, those kind of situations end up and actually they're good because they force you to communicate. You're in absolutely no position to do anything otherwise. You have to go and find someone, or and you end up communicating by any means possible. There's been frequently times when I've been sat in a little mechanic workshop. One example I can think of was in Kosovo, and we just communicating through drawings, and that was it. And those guys have such a willingness to help you in those situations.
Yeah, and I always think that the kettle plays a vital role in any difficult situation. And it was David Bowie of Goodwinch who unknowingly perhaps gave me that advice, because I was listening to him talking to another 4x4 enthusiast, and he said, when you get stuck, first thing you do is put on the kettle. And I thought, that's an interesting concept. But it's true. If you take the time to think about your predicament over a nice cup of tea, first of all, that you calm down a bit and you stop. The anxiety tends to fade, and that gives you a clearer mind, and then you start to think about the solution. So it's always good to take a bit of time to think through the situation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, the kettle does come out quite often. Yeah, that's really cool. So before you mentioned you'd done quite a lot of rock climbing and mountaineering. Was that something you'd always done from a young age?
I in my late teens, I met a Scot who became a good friend of mine, and he was very proficient as a rock climber and mountaineer, and we became friends, and he introduced me to it, and for several years we became mountain buddies, and then I had children. Became a bit too risky, so I went back to it with my son. When my son got to about 16, 17, we picked up and we started off again when my friend and I had left off. So I spent a lot of time up in the Cairngorms with my son, winter climbing and mountaineering. It's great stuff.
That's cool. And certainly over the course of the podcast, I'm sure we're going to interview some people who have kind of huge rigs and probably spend a lot of their time inside those rigs, overlanding. But I think certainly travelling the way you and I travel in a smaller vehicle, you're forced to spend a lot of time outside. And one thing I've noticed is I've just become so much healthier. Like I typically work late until like 2-3 o'clock in the morning. But now we kind of go to bed when it goes dark and get up when the sun rises. And that kind of healthier lifestyle, I think, is certainly beneficial. Like it makes you feel good about life. I think living outside.
I think that I've always been, comfortable in the outdoors. And when I was deciding what vehicle to use, that was part of the decision making. We could have taken a vehicle where we could sleep inside. But I've slept in vehicles before and I don't like it. I don't like sleeping inside. I much prefer the tent. But there is a drawback, of course. If you are travelling across deserts, when you open the roof tent, you tend to get dirty. When you close it down again, you tend to get dirty. So this time round, I'm currently rebuilding the Land Rover. So this time round, I'm looking at ways of taking that away, but keeping the outdoor living. I'm not quite ready yet, even though I'm 61. I'm not quite ready yet to start. Sleeping inside a vehicle and being a camper vanner.
Yeah. I think that connection with nature is certainly something that's lacking in Western culture nowadays.
I think it's something primal about it.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't think it's an overtly manly thing, because, obviously females like it too, women like it too. But I think there's something about connecting with nature and about feeling that, that sort of earthiness of life that I really love. And it's why I like deserts. It's why I like remote places, because you get exposed to that feeling more perhaps more intensely in those places.
And I think a couple of points. There's the way we travel. I think is certainly one of the best ways to see a country. Because you have a real connection with the earth, and especially motorbikers and cyclists. You have a real connection with every bump on that road. I don't know about your car, but we haven't got any AC, so our windows are down constantly. You're getting all the smells and aromas when you drive through a city.
We don't have AC.
Temperatures. You drive up a mountain with your arm out the window, and you can literally just feel the temperature dropping on your elbow. And I think that kind of connection with the country is certainly one of the best ways to experience a country, and the vehicles, however you travel, give you the ability to go and see the parts of the country that typical tourists wouldn't ever get to. I think that's kind of really, really important. The other point is the kind of stripped down aspect to it. Like for us, we sold pretty much everything we own, and that was really quite liberating.
Absolutely liberating.
And when you've been living in your vehicle for however many years, has that changed your life in any profound way when you've kind of come back to civilization and tried to reintegrate into the Western world?
Fundamentally. Fundamentally. Yeah, it's actually thinking about it. It's like coming home. What I mean is it's coming back to England is not like coming home. Having that shift is like coming home, because layers and layers of sort of social conditioning are absorbed by us as we go through life. And if I walk through a store now and I look around me, all I see is unnecessary stuff. And it's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. I buy now what I either need, or I double take and say, do I really want that?
Yeah.
And if I do really want it, then I indulge myself and I buy it.
Yeah.
And it means it becomes a treasure rather than something that's just a consumer item.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to pay a good price now for things that are of high value to me and high quality.
Yeah.
One of the things I came to understand as we travelled was the importance of quality in a consumerist kind of mindset, because we're so used to buying something or having something and then waiting for the next edition, or an upgrade, or something to, if it breaks, we get the chance to buy a new one.
Yeah.
And that sort of emotional rush is something that a lot of people crave. And I see people, I've recently been talking to a few people, and they say that shopping is one of their things they enjoy doing. I can't think of anything worse than doing shopping as an entertainment thing. It's just crazy.
But that satisfaction of whatever they're purchasing is also very short-lived.
Absolutely.
And so, do you think that appreciation of the things you have and the things you need and to kind of live, has that come from living minimally in your vehicle, or do you think it's come from seeing how other cultures?
I think it's a bit of both. Yeah. When you see how people forge a life out of very few things, and how when you experience the real value of life in countries that we consider to be, developing nations, I kind of twist that on its head, really. I think that they're not developing nations. They are countries that have still got attachment to the important things in life and are in danger of losing it. That's the way I see it.
Yeah.
So they are developing, but they may not be developing in a way that's going to be healthy for them in the future.
Yeah.
If you stop in a small village where people have very little, the one thing that you'll soon realise is that people who have very little are often willing to give it away to you.
Yeah, definitely.
We broke down. We had the misfortune of having a transfer box disintegrate in Yalu, which is a small mountain village up in the Andes in Ecuador. And when you travel, you import your anxieties from home into new places. And we broke down, big clatter and bang. We stopped moving, and before 2 minutes were out, the vehicle was surrounded by young men and boys from the village. And our immediate thought was, oh my God, we're surrounded. But then I got out of the vehicle to see what was happening underneath, and immediately was aware they weren't threatening at all. What they were doing was concern for us.
Yeah.
And we stayed in that village for seven weeks. And they pushed us back into the church car park, and they welcomed us into their village. They offered us alternatives for where to sleep. We could sleep in the tent if we wanted to. We could also sleep in a home.
Yeah.
In the end, we thanked them very profusely, and we slept on the floor of a women's cafe that was open one day a week. It was like a women's program from the central government in Ecuador had set up. So we slept on the floor in their cafe for 7 weeks, and every Sunday they would open it up and cook for the community and open it up as a cafe. And in return, we would cook pancakes for them. So they had a little bit of English cuisine on their menu for 7 weeks. And they included us in the community, and took me up getting charcoal from the hills and rounding up bulls and rounding up pigs and doing all sorts of things. And that richness of that sort of connection with their local life was hugely gratifying and humbling, because here we were, apparently very rich Westerners comparatively, and it was no trouble at all to them to welcome us into the community. And in fact, when we left, they gave us a little note in Spanish, and we didn't speak very much Spanish, so we thanked them profusely. And as we drove away, we could see that some were crying,
Oh, wow.
And it was kind of really emotional. And we got to the local, the next town. We went into Google Translate and we translated this little note, and it said, you arrived as strangers, you quickly became friends, but you leave as family.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And that's like amazing, and we've certainly recognised kindness like that as well as we've been travelling, and from everyone we meet. And it's often one of the questions that people actually ask us is, it's that kind of fear and kind of preconception that the world is a terrible place and it's scary, because that's what we've been told by the media.
Yeah.
When people discover some of the countries we've driven through, their general questions are, but weren't you afraid? Did you ever see any trouble? But the reality of it is, everyone in the world is generally nice, and that kindness is unprecedented. And actually, in the West, we don't have that. We don't have that ability to share.
I can't imagine us breaking down in a village in rural England, and people including us in the village life, and being perfectly happy for us to work on our truck in their village, in their church car park for 7 weeks.
Yeah,
just wouldn't happen. I think you're right. I think it links back to what I was saying before about the way communities have still held on to the priceless treasures of community and family, and we tend to have sort of put those second to buying things and getting on, and big houses and fast cars, and one of the things I love about overlanding and visiting and travel is that it reminds you of the importance of those things, and it keeps you in touch with what life's all about, really.
Yeah, and as you've been travelling, then have you noticed that capitalism and consumerism is slowly creeping into some of these places?
Well, I think I'm not sure about consumerism, although I guess, on the back of it, that's the way the model works. But if you drive through Africa now and you drive into African villages, nearly everyone has a mobile phone.
Yeah.
They've completely skipped the idea of landlines.
Yeah.
And gone straight to mobile. It's the same in Central America. In fact, in Peru and Ecuador, you'll perhaps go into a village and it's very typical to see women selling vegetables along the side of the road. That they've walked down from their hill farms, and they perhaps carry a small basket of vegetables. They might have a couple of melons and some fruit and so on. And they will expect maybe to get $2 for the whole day. They'll sell all that and they may get $2. But they've got a cell phone tucked down their bra, and it's a bizarre contrast. And I can see both sides of it. I can see how empowering and liberating that ability to communicate is. So before a cell phone, if that woman wanted to communicate with her family, she had to walk back up the hill. Yeah. So I can see that it makes life easier. But I can also see that the cell phone companies have now got their talons into those people. So it's a dichotomous problem, isn't it? There's a yin and yang to it.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. So you've talked quite a lot about South America just now when we've been talking. I'm guessing it is probably one of your favourite places then.
Well, the favourite places question is
it's very difficult.
It's the first thing people ask. So what's your favourite country? And it's so difficult to answer that because I love pretty much everywhere I went. But there are some things about that I find in overland travel that are really important to me. The first thing is people. So if I was to say, where were the nicest people, I think I'd have to second Colombia and perhaps Kazakhstan. Yeah.
And again, that's really interesting because the two countries you've just mentioned, people certainly from the West have massive preconceptions about both those countries. Yeah. When we say, we're going to the Americas next year, we'd like to go through Colombia, whatever, everyone is like, but it's full of drug dealers, it's like you're going to get robbed, and it's like, well,
but hey,
maybe,
look at the good news. The FARC has just signed a truce, and after 52 years of war, it's good news.
Yeah.
And if you look at what's the best scenery, I love places that remind me of the wildness of the world. So, deserts are important to me, and jungle.
Yeah.
So for me, rather than a country, I would say there's a region, which is a sort of southwestern part of Bolivia, the northeastern part of Chile, the Atacama, and the northwestern part of Argentina. That sort of circular blob that you could land on that part of the world. It is just insanely beautiful, and at the same time, very remote. And so you are constantly reminded every day of, one, the beauty of the world, but also how insignificant you are in it. And that for me is a very humbling experience.
Yeah.
So from an environmental sort of beauty aspect, that would be one place. But also the Central Americas, Costa Rica, a beautiful country, full of vibrant colours and deep luscious greens and rainforest. So I love that too. In terms of experiences, you have those anywhere. So I think it's, I think it's really important when you travel to become more aware of what you're going through in terms of how you travel, what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. Because it'd be so easy to travel quickly to get to a destination and forget the fact that all around you there's absolute, bundles of ore, things you can get intrigued by. We once watched in the Karakoram Desert in Kazakhstan. We stood for 2 hours and watched a dung beetle roll a turd across the desert and bury it. It rolled it from one side of the Land Rover, underneath the Land Rover, out the other side, and then buried it. And of course we stood there asking ourselves, why did it move it? Why didn't it just bury it where it found it?
Yeah.
These sort of questions that you find when you think about what happens in nature.
Yeah.
It's absolutely unbelievable. And in Costa Rica, we watched a monarch butterfly, pupae. I don't know if these are the right way, but we turned from I think it was a pupae into a chrysalis.
Yeah.
It was absolutely awesome. And when it was finished, you look at what it looks like, and it's hanging on this branch, and it's a sort of dark browny grey colour. And for all the world, it looks like a bat. And it's designed like that by nature, so it doesn't get attacked by and eaten by predators. Even down to 2 small golden eyes that are on the outside, so it actually looks like it's unbelievable.
I think that kind of appreciation of the world is, I can totally relate to that, because my wife Emma is a biologist. And typically before we went travelling, I was a proper city boy. I used to spend a lot of time holidaying in New York, San Francisco. I just loved city culture. And so we're kind of the yin and yang of travellers. And so between us we have a nice mix. So we spend a lot of time in cities, and we actually spend more time out in the wild places. But she points things out to me that it just never crossed my mind before. We found an incredible fly. And you in England you have a blue bottle, a housefly, or whatever. And I was like, there are millions of kinds of different fly. The fly we saw, the pattern on its wings made it look like a spider. Yeah. So obviously it wouldn't get attacked. Yeah. And it looked just incredible. But also that kind of appreciation of how wild the world can be, and like you said, how insignificant you are as a tiny person, and I really feel that, especially in deserts. I find that just incredible. But also, when one of my favourite terrains are the high altitude plateaus. Quite often high altitude lakes as well, and certainly through the Pamirs, I was blown away by how wild the world could be. The world, and it was like driving through the parts of the moon at times. And
I think it's one of the things that strikes me in those environments is that when things are going well, it feels very comfortable. It feels just awesome. But it's easy to be reminded of how quickly things can change, and how vulnerable then you become. We were crossing the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia, and we were following a map that was from the previous year, and which showed the routes across the Salar, the safe routes across the Salar. And we went to a location there called Fish Island, or Isla de Pescada, and we followed a route directly south from there towards the route off the Salar. And the navigation was absolutely spot on. The problem was that particular
the world
route,
had changed.
The world had changed underneath the map. So we arrived at the location, but we arrived at 90 degrees to where the actual route from this particular year reached the promontory to come off of the Salar. And we overshot it by, I sort of said to Ellen, "Oh, look at those rocks, I better steer between them." So I steered between them and drove straight across the exit. And 150 metres further on, sank up to the chassis in Salar.
Yeah.
And suddenly the world's changed. You've gone from having a swift drive across some glorious salt to a 2-day dig-out session. We'd hold our diesel tank.
Yeah.
We were, I don't know how many, 100 and plus miles from the nearest habitation. Probably 200-300 miles from the nearest fuel. And you soon realise in those scenarios that if nobody comes, then it's totally up to you to rescue yourself and get to safety.
Yeah.
And so those scenarios can be very quickly, they can very quickly shift you from aren't we having a wonderful day, to a sort of oh crap situation. Yes.
And in those particular circumstances, how do you deal with it? Because
well, you make a cup of tea, of course.
You make a cup of tea, yeah. And actually, yeah. Because we've found ourselves in situations where we've been stuck, and my first reaction, I get incredibly anxious, I panic, I proper freak out, and then, like you said, Emma will make a cup of tea.
It was interesting because I don't freak out. It's one of those. I guess it's something I've learned over the years because I've been in lots of difficult predicaments that I realise that doesn't do anything, it doesn't work. So I stay very clear-headed. But I think Helen, in that situation, her immediate thought process was, "Oh damn, they're going to find a rusted Hulk of a Defender here and 2 skeletons in a couple of years." Whereas I was thinking, this is an interesting problem to get out of.
Yeah.
And actually, that time I had a bit of a dig around the wheels, and it was pretty deep. So I foolishly ran out the ground anchor, and we had to go at winching it. It was very clear from the first attempt that wasn't going to work. We weren't going to be able to winch ourselves out just by using the ground anchor because it was pulling through the salt. So we made a cup of tea, made a meal, and went to bed.
Yeah. And
as I've always believed, that we get our most creative thoughts as we drift off to sleep and as we come back to our waking world. I think that about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly my eyes pinged open, and it became obvious to me what I had to do. So I think taking time to think about your situation when it's not absolutely urgent pays dividends.
Yeah. And so how did you resolve the problem?
Well, it was obvious that what we needed was mechanical advantage, and we need to increase flotation to get out of the mire, because in that particular place the salt was only about 1 inch thick, and then there was about 1.5 inches of silt before the water table. Yeah. So by the time we woke up in the morning, all of the ruts were full of water.
Yeah.
And it's at 14,000 feet. It's very difficult to do any physical activity, and you get exhausted very quick. It's also got insane levels of UV because it's up there with no clouds.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And so we had to, to bear those factors in mind while we were working. Well, what we did was we dug around, and we dug for a day and a half, digging the mud out and the silt out from under the car. We dug ramps. We had 2 waffle boards, so we put those under the rear. We dug down and put those under the rear wheels, and then we emptied the vehicle basically of everything in it so that we could lighten the load.
Yeah.
We let the tyres down to about 1 bar, and then we took inside of our vehicle. We have 2 lockers in the side, and then we have removable shelves, like locker tops, I guess, made out of 6mm plywood. So we took those out and used those as flotation devices, 2 under the front wheels, and then for traction, we buried the spare wheel. Yeah. And we buried the barbecue. Yeah. And we cut a mud bollard. That was something I bought from my mountaineering days. When you cut a snow bollard, cut a bollard in the mud and put a strop around it. Yeah. So we had 3 or 4 points. We had the ground anchor as well. So we had 4 points of anchoring. And with that and the digging, we managed to get out. But of course, we were still on soft ground. Yeah. So then followed another day of moving 3 feet at a time on these waffle boards and shelves, and we actually managed in a whole day. We did 150 metres. Wow! Onto firmer ground. And then we had to carry all the stuff we'd unloaded, 150 metres, 42 trips. It was a lot of work. Yeah.
we earned that cup of tea.
It's a good job you didn't run out of milk.
Yeah, but what we discovered then, of course, was the diesel tank was holed.
Yeah.
So then we had to get fuel, and we stopped every now and again. And every time we stopped, we put a cut down water container underneath to catch the diesel.
Catch
and
whatever is
recycled
dripping.
it.
Yeah.
And we did some calculations about how much we would lose and how much that would mean we would lose over a period of time.
Yeah.
And we did it. Got there.
Very good. That's an interesting story. And is that one of the, like I said earlier, good things come from bad situations, and even in that situation, you might not have met anyone, but you've certainly got a good story out of it, and an interesting memory.
Yeah, and I think
is that one of the worst?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got any really bad memories of it. I think it's. I believe in life, you get from life what you put into it, and if you put in, bad feelings and anxiety, you get bad feelings and anxiety back out. So I always approach these things with an optimistic and sort of curious outlook. So when we got stuck, it was a case of I've got to do this work, and it's a pain. And if I knew now what I knew, if I knew before what I knew now, then I wouldn't have, I wouldn't have tried to persist when I felt the tyres start to sink. I wouldn't have, perhaps gone as fast across the sail. I would have thought about what the rocks might mean. You reflect back and you think, okay, how can I learn from this? But also in the recovery, you're learning all sorts of things, aren't you? About the futility of trying to move when your chassis is on the ground. There's no weight on your wheels. So now those things, all of that experience, I've sucked all the learning out of that. So now I am much more equipped to go into places like that in future.
Okay, that's good. And I think those kind of concerns are also, again, can possibly be quite restrictive to people who are new to overlanding. I think they kind of fear, excuse me, they kind of fear getting into those situations, and so that's kind of holding them back from going out and seeing the world. But it's someone said to me yesterday, it can't have been that bad, you're still here. And ultimately, if you look at it like that, you can end up in some really quite hair-raising situations, but ultimately, you get through it.
Well, it's interesting, because since I've been back, today I'm running a seminar over here at the Adventure Overland Show on self-recovery, strangely enough. But I'm coming at it from a different angle, because I think that you're right. When people get into a scenario like that, just as I did, the default is to do what you were told. This is how you recover a vehicle. You undo the winch and you stick it the ground anchor in the ground and you pull on it, and you make sure you're safe. But unless you actually understand the principles of flotation and traction and mechanical advantage, unless you understand those, you can't be adaptive. I think it's that ability to adapt that creates, your longevity, really. Because if I hadn't been able to do that from my, previous experiences, for example, the mud bollard, if I hadn't had the experience of working in the mountains and creating snow bollards, I wouldn't have had that option. And so I think that being able to understand that actually what I need, and that was the aha moment at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, was what I need is more mechanical advantage. I need a better anchor. And so then my mind went to, so how can I do that? So understanding the problem and sort of reverse engineering it until you get to a point of saying, I understand it now, that gives you a great level of confidence. And I think that's what I've been trying to put back into the community since I've been back in the UK, is bringing that experience of 4.5 years on the road and giving it to other people, not as a, this is how you do it, but of helping them to build their confidence to go and have their own adventures.
And I think certainly with recovery, there are lots of different recovery methods, but they're generally generic and they don't always take into context the surroundings or the situation. Like, for example, just the differences in the salinity and how much water is in that salt can vary massively, and that completely influences how you're going to recover the car, especially in your situation.
We got stuck in Siberia on a steep gravelly slope. It was so steep that when we had the brakes on, we were still sliding down the hill. And no one in a recovery session says to you, when you put your tree strap around a tree and you winch on it, you might pull the tree out of the ground, which is exactly what we did. So nobody gives you that scenario.
Yeah.
And so there's another layer of insight into, what's the soil like around that tree?
Yeah.
How deep do the roots go? Is it actually a solid anchor?
Again, that's interesting because that comes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is your kind of observation of the world and how you look at the world and the understanding of the world. And I mentioned it earlier, and it's something that's lacking, I think, nowadays. And fundamentally, as humans, we exist as biology. That's the basics, biology and physics. And I think to have an understanding of that and an appreciation of the world around you and the mechanics of how the whole world works certainly enlightens you and enriches your life.
Yeah.
And take that kind of transference of skills and knowledge is really quite interesting. Like just you were talking about your experience as a climber, and you knew how to transfer those skills then to recovering your vehicle. Yeah. Are there other skills you had in your previous life prior to being an overlander that you've then brought to the overlanding?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I've led, when I think about it, I've led a blessed life, really. I mean, I've never made stacks of money. I've never had massive networks of friends. But what I've had is lots of opportunities. Whether I've created them or whether they've just fallen at my feet, I don't know. But I've had lots of opportunities to do interesting things. When I left school, my father said to me at the age of 16, he said, "Son," I was asking about career advice actually, and he said, "Well, really, what I'd advise you to do is get a secure job with a good pension."
Yeah.
And I completely ignored that. I've never had a secure job, and I've got no pension to speak of. So, but what I have had is a career path that looks like a series of exciting projects.
Yeah.
Most of which I think I failed at, most of which other people look at and go, wow.
Yeah.
And that's because I set such high standards and such big targets that when I fail after achieving more than most people.
Yeah.
And that sounds perhaps a bit, immodest, but it's the truth,
Yeah. I can totally relate to that, and it's something Emma and I have discussed as we've been travelling. And initially we wanted to do a circumnavigation of the world. We never got that far.
Yeah.
And Emma, she's quite hard on herself. She has pretty high standards. She's like, we failed at doing that. And I'm like, yeah, but in failing, we still achieved exactly what you just said. We still achieved more than what most people did in failing. So I think, yeah.
Well, I have to relate to that because we set these antipodal points.
Yeah.
And I can remember the first one, and we celebrated that in Mongolia, and thinking, wow, we're actually doing this. And then we crossed the equator going south through Ecuador. And I thought, that's the second point. And then we got to the antipodal point in Chile, and we actually had a blazing row at that point. I think that was because we were so, both so totally emotional about, getting to that point. And I can remember it now. It was almost under a cascading waterfall. It was actually a beautiful place. But what it signified for us that we had stuck with it. We had pushed and pushed and pushed through unimaginable difficulties to get to that point. And from there, if we got home, if we managed to get back to the UK, we'd have done what we said.
Yeah.
And linking to that's actually quite emotional. Linking to that was this overwhelming sense that I'd always set these goals for myself and never quite achieved them, even in the eyes of other people achieving great things. But I was determined this thing I was going to finish.
Yeah.
And we did. And it was, I have a huge debt of gratitude to Helen for sticking with me through that, because it was, there were trying times. There were times when we ran out of money 6 times. We faced a lot of stuff. And I'm really, really grateful for that opportunity.
It's. I think when you travel in this way, especially for long periods of time, it can be incredibly testing. We're in the car together 24/7. You're rarely more than a metre away from your partner, and it can get incredibly emotional. And certainly for us, we had times. And it's interesting. You kind of have these goals, and like you said, one of our goals was getting up as far as the Arctic Circle, and that is where we headed straight away. And as soon as we got there, we were like, yeah, holy crap, we're actually doing this. We've achieved one of our first goals. And certainly crossing, the Tropic of Cancer down the equator, having these kind of goals. and it can be incredibly emotional when you achieve some of those. I think one point in our trip, when we crossed into Kazakhstan, was one of the most emotional times, because we had come back from Mongolia when we discovered both my parents were diagnosed with cancer. Kazakhstan was going to be our next country, and in between actually getting to Kazakhstan and leaving Mongolia, we went through all manner of kind of troubles and quandaries and challenges. And then literally we crossed the border into Kazakhstan and we just both burst into tears. It was just like, neither of us had talked about it. Just literally we crossed the border and both just burst into tears, because we knew how much that meant to us, and the kind of hell we'd been through to get there.
Yeah, for a lot of people, I guess, not everyone, but I guess a lot of people, it's easy to go through life and not really connect so much with those emotions, and to be too busy.
Yeah.
To be too busy and too in your head, thinking about what has to be done next. And I think what overlanding does is it slows life down.
Yeah.
It makes you able to appreciate every single moment of every single day.
Yeah, definitely.
And you can, for me, I can't fail to be moved by that. So.
And I think certainly having that stripped down lifestyle, what becomes important are the basics. Where are we going to find food? Where are we going to find water? We need to keep warm. We need to find some diesel, and all the excess stuff that is fluffy and around the edges isn't so important and doesn't carry the weight which it does when you live in the Western world and there's drama going on in your life. All that little small stuff is less important.
And after 3 months of very weak chicken foot soup, you realise how good Philadelphia and Ryvita tastes. Those simple things become absolutely mind-blowingly gorgeous.
Okay, that's interesting. That's really, really interesting. So, as far as we've talked about all kinds of things here, but as far as character traits, what kind of character traits do you think you need to be a good overlander?
What the hell do I know about that?
Problem solving? Well, I think that's a good one.
Well, that's a skill. I mean, you asked early on about you asked early on about what I brought in from my previous life, and I said, yeah. I mean, the thing that I think was invaluable to me was I went through an intensive, very high quality apprenticeship when I was 18 to 22, and it taught me, I think, both the skills and the qualities that saw me through 4.5 years of challenging overlanding.
Yeah.
And those were the ability to work with my hands to make things and fix things. Because there were times when, through lack of budget or lack of facilities, I had to fabricate things or, repair things or make things work and, bodge things to get us out of trouble. But also, I can remember back to my apprenticeship days when learning those skills, the tutors were, at the time I thought they were vicious. In fact, I called them all sorts of names. But they made us discover our persistence and our willingness to just keep on pressing on with hand schools until we made something that worked. I remember I made a pair of pipe wrenches, and we had to polish them until they looked like chrome. They were made from rusty metal, and we had to polish them until they looked like chrome, fabricate them by hand with just basic hand tools. And then we had to case harden them in a forge. And I remember my instructor taking mine, and I'd taken 6 weeks to make these things. And he stuck them in the forge to demonstrate how to case harden them. And he was talking to the group, and all of a sudden I saw sparks coming out of the forge, and he burnt them, totally wrecked them. 6 weeks of work, not up in smoke, but up in sparks. And he said to me, "Oh well, let's start again." And in that next 6 weeks, I learned, how to bounce back, basically.
Yeah.
And those qualities, I think, were what I put into practice. Diligence, attention to detail, persistence, those kind of things. Resilience, really.
Yeah.
Resilience.
Yeah.
Sums it up in one word.
Okay, that's really cool. That's interesting. And I certainly think, not just as an overlander, but I think just generally in life, I think if you can have practical skills and have an understanding, and again, it comes down to an understanding of the world around you. If you can appreciate how a material works and the qualities of that particular material,
Absolutely.
and an understanding of where that material's come from and what it's capable of doing,
Yeah.
I think that kind of appreciation of the world around you helps you solve problems, which in turn are skills that are transferable across anything.
Absolutely right.
Like I can totally relate to that. Like I had an art education. I went to art school, and some of the things we were taught are now skills which I can use within overlanding, and a lot of it's to do with solving problems, understanding materials, and looking at things from an alternative perspective, which is kind of what you did while you were sleeping, and you woke up and had that idea, and like, this is what we need to do. You have that kind of moment of clarity where, yes, this all makes sense. I can understand it and look at it from an outside perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, I'm just aware of time. We've been 55 minutes.
Wow.
That's a pretty interesting
Doesn't
chat.
time fly when you're
Doesn't
enjoying
time fly.
It's nice to hear that the sounds, the environmental sounds have quietened down a bit too. The clatter.
Yeah, I don't know how there was so much noise and slamming of doors when we've been sat around this lovely campfire the whole time.
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay, so future plans, just very, very briefly. Are you
Well,
planning another trip?
Yeah, well, the Land Rover's in rebuild. I've got it on
Yeah.
my drive, and it's completely stripped apart from the bodywork. It's going right there down to the chassis.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got some plans for getting that fixed up. I'm going to change the style of the rear load area.
Yeah.
But essentially it will remain an exploration vehicle rather than a live-in vehicle. I'm working on a solution now to still be able to sleep in a tent but not have to open it from the top of the roof.
Yeah.
So that will probably be a shell clamshell type design.
Yeah.
But I'd like some undercover area too that comes with that tent.
Yeah.
The difficulty with clamshell designs, they don't give you much shelter when you're getting in and out.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at that, working on that now.
Okay.
Next year, I have a cycling adventure first in the spring.
Oh, okay. Maybe we'll have to
Yeah, I'm
interview you again
cycling
for
from
that
John
one.
O'Groats to Land's End.
Okay,
and
cool.
I'm climbing the 3 highest peaks in Great Britain on the
Yeah.
way. And then I should finish the rebuild of the Land Rover in the summer.
Yeah.
And then hopefully be off on some adventures in the autumn. Not sure where yet, but that's my plan.
Very, very good. And just one very, very quick question, because I don't want to drag on too long and keep you too long, but we certainly have a real connection with our vehicle. It's to the point where we've given it a name, which some people find a bit tedious.
Yeah.
But do your vehicle have a name, or do you have feelings for it, or could you part with it?
Okay, that's 3 questions.
Yeah.
It does have a name. It's an inspirational and very creative name. We call it Landy.
Yeah.
And it will probably change its name, I think,
Yeah.
this time round. It might reflect on some of the things that we've gone through and sort of... I'm quite tempted to use an African name.
Yeah.
Yeah, emotionally connected to it. I think it's probably undeniably bonded to me now. I think it's
Yeah.
not going to go anywhere. So I'll be keeping it until, I'll pop my clogs probably.
Yeah.
It'll become an heirloom for my son, I expect, or my daughter. They're both
Okay.
adventurous people, so...
Very good. Okay, and just finally, is there anything you want to promote or tell our listeners about?
Not promote specifically, but just to say that keep an eye out, because I am starting to offer a service for people who want to learn about, recovery and bush maintenance and stuff.
Yeah.
And that will be, available on Facebook as soon as we've got details.
Okay, perfect. And actually, I can promote that once you have the details. I can send it out to our
cool.
listeners also.
Excellent.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.
And for me, it's amazing because we've had this kind of online conversation over the years, and I guess mutual respect, is the way to describe
I think
it.
we started before you, didn't we? And so you were following us, and then you were carrying on, so we followed you. It's kind of cool.
And that's certainly something that's happening now. There's people who we've inspired to travel who've just recently left, literally as we've come home, and now we're following those guys as well.
Absolutely right, yeah. I think what's significant is just how big the overlanding community has become in 5 or 6 years. It's awesome.
Yeah. Interesting. But there are pros and cons to that.
There are indeed.
We'll save that for another hour.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. It was an absolute pleasure to chat with Paul. It got a little emotional at times. He's a logical fella, a trait that is certainly beneficial to any overlander. I could have spent way more than an hour talking to him. If you think our interviews are too short, please do let us know. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and review us on iTunes and Stitcher by searching the Overlanding Podcast, and please check out our website, www.theoverlandingpodcast.com. On there you'll find supporting information, photos and links about each episode. We'd love to engage with our listeners, so please find us on Facebook / The Overlanding Podcast, and on Twitter @Overland Podcast. You can help support the show just by listening and telling others about it. If you like what you've heard, please share it with your friends and help spread the word. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we'd love to hear from you. We'd especially like to hear from cyclists and motorcyclists who've undertaken longer trips. You can email us at aroundtheworldin800days@mail.com with the subject heading podcast interview. Okay, until next week, keep your eyes on the road.